members of the York County Heritage Trust, I'd like to welcome everybody here this evening. We have a tremendous crowd. I think we're at full capacity, and it's great to see all of you. Thank you for joining us as we celebrate the accomplishments of General Jacob Devers. Someone recently referred to General Devers as the most accomplished military general you never heard of. But I'm confident that this group has most certainly known of Jake Devers and his achievements. Undoubtedly, you are here to delve further into General Devers' life with research conducted by Dr. Scott Wheeler. Shortly, I'll turn the podium over to Dave Pollock to introduce our guests, but before doing so, we want to acknowledge a few guests in the audience this evening. Representative Kristen Phillips. She was here just a short while ago, but she had to leave just a few minutes ago, unfortunately. And we also have Representative Seth Grote. I would also like to thank the individuals who brought this event together, including Randy Flom, who is providing videography services, and the sponsors who provided the financial backing for the exhibit and program. A special thank you goes to Gladfelter Insurance Group and to Mr. and Mrs. Louis Appel Jr. for their sponsorships of this program this evening. Significant appreciation also goes to Daley Einstein and Baker Tilly, formerly known as SF & Company. And an additional thank you is due to Grit, formerly known as Moxie, for creating marketing materials, brochures, and posters for this event. I also extend a special thank you to our staff, interns, and volunteers who created the exhibit on the mezzanine. Megan Carr, Rachel Warner, Lotta Foreman-Shaw, Alexandra Knight, Amanda Eebler, Rich Robinson, and Dan Rowe, as well as the entire staff of the York County Heritage Trust, who do a tremendous job with all the programs that are presented on behalf of the Trust. Truth be told, though, the events this weekend are entirely due to the enthusiasm and support from Dave Pollock and his daughter, Elise Pollock. They are World War II students and as such attend the annual conference devoted to the war study. Their experiences echo much of what we know about York County history, so at this point, I would ask Dave to share their story. Dave?
I think we're all friends here this evening because we share three important things: a love of history, a love of York, and a love of our Heritage Trust. It turns out that this all started about a year ago. My daughter and I do attend the annual international conference at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And those of you who have not yet been there, please make it a point to go there. It is a remarkable experience. They're opening a new wing this year on the road to Tokyo. But while we were there, one of the speakers was Dr. Wheeler. And I'm seated next to my daughter, and we're leafing through the materials, and Dr. Wheeler's talking, and all of a sudden he says, "There is an underappreciated, misunderstood general from York, Pennsylvania, Jake Devers." And I get an elbow in my ribs. My daughter said, "That's where we're from." I said, "You're right, that is where we're from." Minutes later, Dr. Wheeler said, "There is a treasure trove of knowledge located at the York County Heritage Trust." Another elbow in the ribs, because we know and love Joan and her fabulous staff who here do work that is underpaid and underappreciated, but terrific nonetheless. So it turns out that not only is this a story of history and of York and of the Heritage Trust, but it's great human drama. We were mesmerized by Dr. Wheeler's discussion of how Jake Devers was underappreciated, misunderstood, not flashy enough. And I walked up immediately after his lecture and found him in the room where speakers would sit and chat with people and said, "You got to come to York. This is amazing." He said, "Well, by coincidence, I'm writing a book." Dr. Wheeler is a man who has worn many hats. And first and most important, many of you here are veterans. My father was 82nd Airborne, and I want to first acknowledge that he is a retired colonel with 30 years of experience serving as commander of armor units and aviation units in the U.S. Army. He has a laundry list of alphabet letters, a BA in history, an MA in history, a PhD in history, an MA in strategic studies. And so in addition to all that and his service to our country, he ended up being the chair of international history at West Point for many years. So he comes to us with the credentials and the experience to be able to talk about Jake Devers. I think one of the things I will also shamelessly point out is there's a book he has written which you all need to read. It's the history of the Big Red One, and it covers World War I all the way through to, I believe, the Gulf War. I read the book. It was one of those ones that annoyed my wife because at 2 a.m. I'm still flipping pages and she's saying, turn the light out. So it is a fabulous book. I shamelessly also will tell you to read that one. But we're here today instead because we're celebrating a book about one of our people, one of the people from York. A good book about history, about World War II, and a great human interest story. And since a good portion of that came from the Heritage Trust, I think it's only appropriate we're here tonight to not only celebrate the history of General Devers, but also our Heritage Trust. Dr. Wheeler?
Hopefully, am I working okay? Sounds like we're working all right. Let me hide this thing in my pocket. I wish I'd known I was going to have these audio-visual things. I would have lost a few pounds so my trousers don't split, but that's neither here nor there. And one of those I push going forward, right? Page down, page up. Good. First of all, I need to thank the York County Heritage Trust. This is a gold mine, and I hope all of you are members of the foundation as well as members of the trust. I am so impressed. I've worked in lots of archives on the 5 books my wife and I have researched and we've written, and this is the best place to work. And that says a lot because we work some wonderful places like MHI, which is a great staff, and the National Archives. So thank you very much for the support you give, and I hope you'll continue and really make that extra effort as they go through a challenging period, as we all are in the nonprofit world doing. Also want to thank the archivists here who have been just great. Lila, I think everyone knows Lila Forum Shawl. If you don't, she's wonderful. Really appreciate her. And she's bent over backwards allowing us to do everything we can that's legal and not too fattening. So it's been great. And then Victoria Allen is here tonight. She came in from, was it Cleveland? Toledo. That's all the same part of the country. Lovely part of the country, right? So she came in tonight. She was really great help when we were doing our research. We've been working here for, I think, 7 years. I was trying to remember, and we've been a member of the York County Heritage Trust that long, and we'll continue for the rest of our lives. And then, of course, Dave and Elise, thank you so much for making this happen. And Dan wrote it, all the things that take effort and technical knowledge, and a whole bunch of folks. So, and last but not least, and it always embarrasses her and my other friends, that my wife Jane and I worked on, well, we were served together 30 years in the Army, and that's a lot of things my wife did for a lot of families in the U.S. Army, whether I was there or overseas or whatever. And she has just been tremendous help. And there's always behind every successful historian there's a wife telling him how dumb he is, and that's perfect. And then my great friend Hal Nelson, who's here. General Nelson, where are you hiding? And he's speaking tomorrow, and that's why I also wanted to bring him up, because he's going to put it in context tomorrow morning, and we're having a great panel discussion, which will be very different than tonight. How in the heck did I get involved in this mess? That's always a good question when you spend 7 years of your life researching and writing a book. And I was with Hal Nelson, General Nelson, and Rick Atkinson. We were getting ready to do a staff ride in Germany for the U.S. Army Europe for the commanding general and a busload of generals. And if you lose a busload of generals, every colonel's happy because that's a busload of promotions. But, okay, I can't go over that side. I'm a wanderer. So anyway, I said to General Nelson, who has written a good book about Jacob Devers? Because we were dealing with 6th Army Group and 7th Army and 1st French Army, which he commanded those. And he looked at me and said, there isn't one. And then Atkinson said, but you're going to write it. And I said, yeah, sure. Well, you notice that Rick wrote the intro because that's what he owed me after getting me in this quagmire. So we enjoyed doing it. It's been a labor of love, an interesting man. And I just wanted to explain tonight why this nation should not forget Jake Devers. every town, every state, not every town, but every state had a general serve in World War II. And we're proud of them, justifiably proud of them. Every town, I think, in America had heroes. And a hero to me was somebody that went up and did their duty and then came home and got on with life and did their best for their country. And they're incredibly. We've got an 11th airborne veteran here, which is incredibly wonderful. Are there any other World War II veterans in the audience? So I'm very flattered to be able to speak to you gentlemen, and I thank you for your service. You did a great job.
I was after World War II.
That's still good. You were serving it.
I had an uncle who died at the Philippines.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it's incredible history. And our country is built on that. Yes, sir?
I was on one of the carriers that gave air support for Operation Dragoon.
Excellent. Yeah, there are 8 baby carriers, if I remember correctly, in that operation. Or 9. Thank you. See, and many of you, feel free to correct me in the Q&A. And if I say the wrong name, realize I'm trying to say the right name. So we got into Jacob Devers. What I want to convince you is that he's not just another general who came from a state in the United States and served in our country. And those guys are all great. Or not great. They did a super job, and I'm proud of them. Devers deserves to be remembered as much or more so than a guy you might have heard of, Omar Bradley. Now let's see if this will work for me. Okay. I'm probably pushing the wrong button. Okay, Dan, help me out. I'm a historian, not a technological. I'm probably pushing the wrong thing, aren't I? Okay, push it down. Got it. Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, I taught history, European history instead of military history at West Point because military history you have to do things technological. We all know this gentleman. He was a superb commander and deserves to be remembered, and we have remembered him. And he wrote a Kiss and Tell book in 1948 that earned a Pulitzer Prize, and he had one paragraph in the entire book that mentioned 6th Army Group. And he had to deal on the left flank with an Army group commanded by this gentleman who was hard to like sometimes, easy to hate, but was a great general, and we remember him, and he's got books written about him. Yeah, well, we do too, that's okay. And we remember the gentleman that Ike is talking to in the upper panel, that's his classmate, Omar Bradley, commanded another Army group. Everybody remembers him, supposedly the soldier's general. And I think that's not accurate, but that's neither here nor there. He was a very fine general. He did a great job in Sicily with the Corps, and he did a very good job at Cobra in Normandy, and you all remember him. We also remember that crazy guy in the lower left panel, who had a squeaky voice, named George Patton, but who was also a very competent general, and we've heard about him. He had diaries. He had early biographies. These men had books written about them in the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s, and they shaped the way Americans thought about World War II. And there's a forgotten guy who I think deserves every bit the credit they got, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. If you walk away from here without anything else, it should be that this guy served the country in an extraordinarily competent manner. He shaped the Army. He led in combat. He really was a terrific soldier, and you should be proud of him and remember him easily as much as those other gentlemen I flashed up there. So, what did he do in the war, Daddy? The old saying, what did you do in the war, Daddy? Let's take a look and why we should remember. He went to West Point in 1905 from New York, and I know tomorrow we're going to have a very good presentation on his time in York that I think you'll enjoy at that panel. And that's with his mother. He had a very good upbringing in York. Interestingly, he went to an integrated high school, which is pretty unusual in 1905, which I think may have helped him later on deal with the evolving challenges of integration in the United States Army. He is unusual, though, in that Eisenhower had 1 year of troop duty before he became a general. Jacob Devers had about 13 or 14 years with soldiers. So that's a huge difference between him and these other men. And so just that alone makes his service incredible on the things he did. He began as an artilleryman at Vancouver Barracks, Washington. His first assignment was to the 4th Field Artillery, which was a pack artillery outfit. So little 140-pound Jake Devers had to learn how to load 250 pounds onto mules that are as high as he is, because he's about my height. And he did it, and he worked for a guy named Leslie McNair, who's in that picture also, his battery commander. You may have heard of Leslie McNair. He commands Army ground forces in World War II, and also is a guy that deserves a tremendous amount of credit. Devers loved the artillery. He was in, this is a little later artillery, but he loved the horses. He became a penultimate polo player. He was a very athletic officer, and the artillery appealed to him for a whole variety of reasons. He married Georgie Lyon Devers. Georgie was from the Washington, D.C. area. Her uncle was Jake's battalion commander. And what they do in Army battalions, if you've got some poor bloke that's a bachelor, you troll in front of them the daughters of your best friends to try to get him married off to a West Point graduate or an Army officer. And that truly is what they were doing. He was sure he was going to stay single for 5 years, and like many of us, he didn't do that. He got married young. He got married in 1911, and they were married till she died in 1967. They had one child. But she was a big part of it, and in the book, my wife and I tried to emphasize all the things we could find about Georgie Devers. Her letters to Jake told us about the distaff side of a career spent in the service of their nation, and some of those incredible things that they did as a team. And so we wanted to do that. He served at West Point in the mathematics department, worked for a guy named Eckel. He got to West Point just as it began to enter the modern world. And someday it'll get to the 21st century, I think. I'm just kidding. Their football team is still somewhere else. But he was a math P. He was given the second to the bottom section of cadets because he had an ability to deal with people. And these were the cadets who were most in danger of being flunked out of West Point. And he said his goal in his oral histories were that he wanted to help them survive at West Point, get them through the math course. Now, the man who gave us all this information about Devers, who really began this thing, was a fellow named Colonel Tom Grease. And when I reported into West Point to teach in 1977 for my first 3-year tour there, Grease was the head of the department. And Tom Grease was writing the definitive history of Jacob Devers. And in your archive are thousands and thousands of pages of oral interviews that Colonel Grease did. And so that contribution was huge. Plus, myself and a lot of other Army officers were afforded the opportunity to get PhDs before we went back to the regular Army line. So we'll talk about him more tomorrow, but I wanted to mention this gentleman. Devers then went to Hawaii, and he was in the first motorized artillery unit in the U.S. Army. Now, we're building up to a basis of knowledge that's going to be incredibly valuable to him in his later years, because he's in the first unit to actually have motorized artillery. This is I believe that's a 4.7, does it look like? Or it's a 155 gun being pulled by a tractor. And he had motorcycles, and the guys always fell off him. When World War I began, he was sent to Fort Sill, and he went from being a captain to being a full colonel in a year and a half. And he did a lot to establish the School of Fire and to work very hard on training Army officers for the artillery in World War I. They went from something like 250 or so field artillery, I hope I said field artillery, I meant field artillery officers, to something like 6,000 field artillery officers. So it was a really important job. He, like Eisenhower, did not go to World War I. He stayed in the States. He felt he missed out and that his career was ruined. And that's natural for soldiers, the regular Army, that don't get into the fight. But those are great pictures. Fort Sill up upper left, and the guns they used, I think that's a 3-inch down on the lower left, but it could be a 75 and then a 155. And then he went to West Point. Now, West Point was kind of interesting because he worked directly for Douglas MacArthur because he was in command of the artillery detachment at West Point, a unit of 200 soldiers that had 2 batteries of artillery, one of them horse-drawn and one of them tractor-drawn. And so he was still in command of troops, but he also reported directly to the superintendent for that job, and then he was the senior artillery instructor. So at a very early time, he's exposed to MacArthur, who at that point was brimming with ideas about how to bring the Army into the modern age, and had a very important transformational part of West Point's history. He was also a baseball coach. And at both of his tours, or excuse me, manager, at both of his tours at West Point, he managed the baseball team. And in 1915, the Army team went undefeated. And on that team was a fellow named Omar Bradley. So he began to get connected with a whole bunch of future Army officers. In the 30s, he commanded an artillery battalion at Fort Myer. And there it was interesting because at Fort Myer, they became the demonstration troops. So when the King and Queen of England came, for example, or the Prince of Wales, or whatever, and they needed somebody to put on a show, Devers, in his unit, was always chosen to do that. And one of his officers said of him that he took a unit that was a show unit, made him into a better show unit, but also made him into a field unit. So what that tells us about Devers is a personality that understood the mission at hand, but also understood that in the big scheme of things, you've got to train your junior officers for the future. And so that artillery part of it was a big chunk of that. He was a polo player. He started playing polo at West Point. And I think that tells you a lot about his personality. He had never ridden a horse other than Grandpa Luke's had a farm just west of here, as you know. There's a Luke's Road west of town, and I think the farm is out that direction. And the only horse he had ridden was sort of the dray horse that they had to pull the carts. And he got to West Point, and every West Point cadet had to take equitation. I'm probably mispronouncing that word. Learning how to ride horses is the 25-cent version. And there he not only learned how to ride horses, but he fell in love with polo. And you've got to think about everything polo entails, and it tells you about his personality. He said that training polo ponies was a great preparation for leading soldiers. He says this in one of his interviews. He said it teaches you when to have a firmer hand and a lighter hand. And one of his characteristics as an Army leader will be that when he finds someone that can do the job, he plays a lighter hand. And when he needs someone to push a little bit, he played a heavier hand. Now, lots of people only can play one. And this is successful leaders managed to figure that one out. Each officer who played polo, each artillery officer had 2 horses in the U.S. Army until 1940. And if you played polo, you could have 2 more, and the Army would provide a place for them to stay, and you paid for a striker to take care of the horses. And you have to train a polo pony. His first one was an old Western quarter horse that was used to cutting out cows in the state of Washington. And he went on to own some nice horses. He played a lot with this guy. Third one from the left. Anybody to identify that officer? Patton. That's George Patton. They're classmates, and they're very good friends. And they played polo together. Their families lived next to each other at Fort Myer. Of course, they went to the academy together. And Jake thought that Patton was one of his best friends, and he was until Jake got promoted to general before Patton did. That seemed to have affected the relationship a little bit. And I say that because if you read Patton, you'll see negative things said about Jacob Devers that have no basis in fact. And you've got
Devers in these pictures?
I'm sorry, Devers is the 4th one. He's the captain of the polo team. This picture was taken in 1932, and it was at the War Department's Invitational Polo Tournament in Washington, D.C., or near Fort Myer. And so Devers is the captain of the team, and to this day, at the Patton House in Massachusetts, are the silver cups that these guys won, with the names engraved on them. And there's several more cups up here in your display. And by the way, that display upstairs, if you have not seen it, it is superb and gives you a really good feel of Jake Devers' connection to York, and then his time at West Point, and then on into the Army. So I hope you'll take some time and look at that. That's very nicely done. And Devers had 79 albums of photographs here in the archive. And Jane and I were going through those today for something we're going to do in the Hudson Valley in April. So again, it's another great archive. He loved polo. He said polo is just, it gives you those things officers should have. It requires aggressiveness, teamwork. He said Patton had better ponies, but he was always charging off. And I had to cover for him. Well, that's an important trait, to know when you have to cover for a very talented officer, because you work as a team. You know your fellow officers' strengths and weaknesses, and a good team covers for each other in a positive way. He then went to West Point in 1936. Initially, he was the equivalent of the director of intercollegiate athletics. And if anybody likes Army football, they probably didn't like Devers in 1938. Because what West Point used to do is They would allow people to come in at up to age 22, and they did not sign on to the NCAA rule of 3 years of eligibility. So someone could play for Harvard for 3 years, or for Penn State, or for some football power, come to West Point and get 3 more years of eligibility in football, because this was before the NFL was such a lucrative thing. So West Point wins they have winning seasons from 1905 to 1938. And he convinced them, as director of athletics, that they needed to accept the NCAA ruling on 3 years of eligibility for intercollegiate athletics. And after that, Army team didn't do so good. I think they don't win against Navy until 1944. And so I'm sure that some of his buddies were kind of irritated at him. By the way, in that picture, on the left, there's 3 gentlemen there marching, is the battalion commander. His name is Omar Bradley. And he, at that point, I think he was either a major or a lieutenant colonel. In the middle is the superintendent. Oh gosh, I just dropped his name. It'll come back to me. It's not important. And Jake Devers was the executive officer. While at West Point, he was instrumental in the building of the field house. He was instrumental in the furnishing of the gymnasium. He changed the railroad line in cooperation with the West Shore Railroad. And if you ever go to West Point, they have the North Athletic Fields north of the field house. He created those by getting the railroad to agree to move their line further into the river, and he provided the fill for that from construction going on around the post. He managed the budgets. He becomes the first executive officer in West Point's history, because the place was really growing by then in 1939. So he has a real footprint at West Point. We've talked about his time there as a cadet briefly and mathematics instructor. And then he went back and was the senior artillery instructor and commanded that unit, and now he's back. So in his career, West Point should really appreciate this guy. And he also began the building of Fort Stewart Airfield, which is now a civilian airfield, but it became an Army Air Corps training facility in the early 40s. And in each of those jobs, when he got a job, he got things done. I think you have to say that he's the kind of person that can occasionally be a battering ram and certainly cuts red tape. And we'll see some more examples of that. In 1939, as a colonel, he's sent to Panama because George Marshall has just become chief of staff and has realized that the commander in Panama is not doing an adequate job. At that point in time, we know we have to increase our defenses in Panama, Manila, Honolulu, and so there's a real push to build barracks, new facilities in Panama to accommodate anti-aircraft units, 4 regiments of infantry, Air Force planes, and the chief of staff of Panama is the guy in charge of construction. And it wasn't going well. So he was sent down there, and by December, when his new boss, Van Voorhees, arrives, he has really gotten a grip on it and is doing a tremendous job building the place. He also had a downside. The letters from Georgie are quite interesting. Georgie was his wife. I mentioned her earlier, Georgie Lyon. And she lived at Quarry Heights, which looks down on the harbor on the Atlantic side of Panama. I haven't been there, but I think it would be pretty terrific to go. She looked down there and she said there were ships coming in carrying these people from Europe who were illegal aliens. They were Jewish, and they could only be kept there for about 90 days. And they put them in warehouses with leaky roofs, and they would not let the Army doctors provide medicine for them because Congress had decreed that we're not going to take care of them. And then we put them on ships and they went back to Europe. And she said we're being barbarized. And that's pretty prescient on her part. And then she also wrote that in early 40 that storm clouds are coming, this life may change dramatically. Our life may change dramatically. Her letters give you that sort of inside gut feel that he never had time to put on paper. He quits playing polo basically in 1939-40 because his job picks up so dramatically with his responsibilities. By the way, that fellow Van Voorhees is the grandfather of the armor branch. And so you'll see in a minute why he was important to Jake's career. Van Voorhees wrote of Devers that he's the best general in the Army. In 1940 in Jake's officer efficiency report. By the way, one of the things your archive now has is the only copy of his entire personnel file outside of the Center of Military History, which we got and used. And so we have all of his efficiency reports from 1909 to 1949. If you ever want to go in there, talk to Lila, look at those. They're really pretty interesting once you kind of break the code, because military writing always has a code. We don't know how to write good plain English, I guess. He was then picked to be the commanding general of the 9th Infantry Division, which was a cadre. There were about 4,500 soldiers, and their base was Fort Bragg. And Marshall sent him down there saying, Fort Bragg needs to be built. Right now it'll hold 5,000 troops. By next June, you need to be able to hold 65,000 troops. And this is the great buildup, because in 1940, the U.S. Army goes from about 260,000 soldiers total, and a year later, 1.7 million. It is an incredible task, and it couldn't have been done without the officer corps being able to do the things like Devers did. We were lucky in that we had the CCC during the 30s. The Army hated the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, because the Army was tasked to run it. And let's pretend I'm Second Lieutenant Scott Wheeler, and I want to be a swashbuckling soldier. And all of a sudden, I'm out in Butte, Montana, or in Lolo, Montana, where my father was in the CCC, and I'm the second lieutenant from West Point, and I'm stuck out there with a bunch of snotty-nosed Montanans, like my father. And we bring on active duty 5,000 reserve officers during this same period of time, and 2.5 million Americans go through the CCC. It's the first positive things the U.S. Army had done with the civilian population on such a scale. Because in most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Army's interface with civilians, when we weren't in a civil war, was busting strikes in Butte, Montana, and other strikes in Pennsylvania and in the coal fields. And that's a pretty negative view. And the CCC was huge, but it was also huge because that many Americans served in the CCC for up to 3 years. And they got an inkling of discipline. You had to make your bed. My dad had to get out of bed at time when he was told, and you couldn't talk back, and all those cool things. So it was pretty interesting. He takes over the 9th Division. He arrives for his welcome ceremony. The 9th has about 4,000 troops. It's a rainy day. He pulls up in his car, and we're talking about this guy's character, too. And he looks at the troops in the rain, and they have no overcoats because they haven't been issued yet. Because the country is just doing all it can to build up. It's the fall of 1940. Industry hasn't caught up. And so he throws his overcoat in the back of the car, goes up on the podium, takes the review with no coat, shortens the review dramatically, and says to the troops, I know that you have no hot water in your barracks, but by next Saturday you'll have hot water. Now that's a pretty big promise. What he does is he figures out how somebody who can go get him a couple steam locomotives, and they get them on base, and they hook them to the steam system, and they have hot water. Now, I know lots of people who just sit on their hands saying, I can't do it, the red tape's in my way, the bureaucracy's keeping me from doing it. I don't think this is in Jake's vocabulary, the more you look at the guy. The 9th Division becomes one of the best divisions in World War II. They fight in North Africa first, and then they'll go on to fight in Europe and do a very fine job. So, and he did it, part of that. He had a guy named Loving and a guy named Peace were the two civilian contractors. And here he really learns how to work with civilian contractors. He had done some of that at West Point. He called them his peace-loving team, which I think is pretty cool. And they built Fort Bragg. They built 586 barracks in a year. They built the whole road system. All that stuff. And when a newspaper man who was very critical of the way the Army was doing things came to Fort Bragg, Jake said, I'm going to give you a map, I'm going to give you a lieutenant, and a jeep. You go anywhere you want. He's not a spy. He's just to get you around. You write about anything you want, but when you find something wrong, come back and tell me so I can fix it. Yeah. And he gets incredibly good press from this guy, needless to say. So he knew how to do a lot of things. This is a great picture of he and Georgie. I just threw that in there. It doesn't tell you tons, except that one of the ways you still exercised in those days was to ride your horse. George Marshall rode most days during the entire World War II. That was his exercise. And, you need to do something physical if you're doing something mental all day. He does a really good job at Bragg. The armored force is a mess. George Patton and the cavalrymen want a light armored force, fast tanks, lots of machine guns, saber-drawn, pistol-flashing cavalrymen. The infantry, who controls armor, wants a heavier tank that'll move slower with the infantry, and they don't envision a tank that's going to be very fast. They want it to be well armored, a little more protection. So Marshall, George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, says, I got this fight between the cavalrymen and the infantrymen. What am I going to do? And the head of the armored force is dying of cancer. And so Adna Chaffee, considered to be the father of the armored force, Van Voorhis was the grandfather of the armored force. The first armored organization was a Van Voorhis one in the 30s. Van Voorhis says, why not send Jake there? Marshall says, good idea. And so he becomes the commanding general. As an artilleryman, he cuts all that parochial stuff out, because his branch doesn't have a dog in the fight. He is instrumental, though, in shaping that branch. The upper vehicle is the Sherman tank, 50-some thousand of them built. Not a perfect tank, but a really good tank. It's got more armor and bigger gun than the cavalryman like Patton wanted. It's got a very reliable engine because Jake Devers figured out that what we need is a test organization at Fort Knox that can take 10 engines and run them over and over 24 hours a day in the mud, in the rain, in the dust, and figure out how to get a really good, reliable engine. He worked closely with Chrysler and Ford Motor Company to design the right equipment. He got the Ordnance Office to establish a permanent headquarters in Detroit to liaison more effectively. He pushed really hard to get the Army to have just one organization in charge of armor procurement, and he broke red tape. Lower left was one of his subordinates said, a guy named Ted Brooks said, we need a self-propelled artillery piece, a 105, on a track. And Devers said, well, go figure it out. Again, training that polo pony, light hand, and Ted Brooks only needed a light hand. And Ted Brooks pushes the effort to create what will be known as the Priest. It's the M7 self-propelled artillery piece, lower left. It's probably, I think, without question, the best self-propelled gun of World War II, howitzer. Very fine piece of equipment. The other vehicle is a duck, and it doesn't quack. It's DUKW is the first 4 letters of the first one's serial number. And so they said, I'll call it a duck. To the best of my knowledge, that's where it came from. Now, General Nelson's probably the only one that could contradict that. Hopefully he's asleep by now, and so he went. Vannevar Bush was the science advisor to the President of the United States. And Ike was writing home from Sicily saying that the duck was invaluable in the invasion of Sicily because it could go from ship to shore, onto shore, unload, come back. And he said, that was terrific. So Marshall writes a nice note to Vannevar Bush, the science advisor, who had played a role in this, a big role in this. Vannevar Bush wrote back and said, well, thank you, but the real credit goes to Jake Devers, who broke the red tape. The Army wasn't interested in this vehicle until Devers broke the red tape. That's pretty telling. So Marshall sent a nice letter to Jake saying, well done, Jake. Yeah. He also got a guy named George Patton to go out to California and create the Desert Training Center. And Patton said, what are you doing, trying to sideline me, Jake? Jake said, listen, George, I'm not in competition with you. I'm setting you up for success. When we go to war, the Brits are fighting the Germans in North Africa. We need a desert capability. Now get out there and do it. About that blunt to his friend George Patton. And Patton creates it and does a really good job with it. In May of 1943, Devers is still head of the Armored Force. He's helped create 14 armored divisions for the United States Army. We already had 2 on hand, 2 in forming. All the armored tank battalions, and built the school, built Fort Knox up. And the commanding general of the European theater in England was Ike, but Ike was made commander in the Mediterranean for the operations in North Africa, Sicily, and into Italy. So they needed a commander. So they put an airman in charge of England because you needed to build up the 8th Air Force for the combined bomber offensive. And the guy who was a commander of that was General Andrews, who was the first Air Force officer, by the way, to be a senior officer on the Army staff. And about the May 3rd, I think it was, his airplane hit a mountain in Iceland, and he and all of his compatriots on the plane were killed, and Devers took over in Europe. He was given 48 hours to pack and move. And then his wife, Georgie, was left doing all the moving from Fort Knox back into a house in the Washington, D.C. area, and which was the norm for Army spouses as the war developed. They were left as their spouse went off to war, and they had to deal with a whole bunch of things. She had never dealt with the complexity of that, and she did a great job. But the business of the commander in Europe is 8th Air Force. The theory is, the Air Force theory, is that we have to defeat the Luftwaffe before we can invade Europe. And the Air Force says, we don't need the Army to do this. We can do this. We'll just send our bombers over Germany or over France in daylight, in tight formations, with 10 machine guns on every bomber. And then as the Luftwaffe fighters come swarming up, we'll just shoot them down. And that will break the back of the Luftwaffe. Great theory. So Ira Aker is the commander of that Air Force. The problem is the Luftwaffe is shooting down our planes and crews faster than we're shooting down the Luftwaffe. Every raid, 10% of the planes are shot down and destroyed. And 70% in 43 of every group that went over the continent were shot up by the enemy. And it got to be to the point where we couldn't deploy the bombers and the air crews out of England. And Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, sends a letter to Jake and says, do you need a really hard-charging person to fix the problem? And that was Ira Aker he's going to relieve. And Devers writes back, he isn't the problem. You're the problem. We need more bombers. We need 2 bombers for every crew. We need more crews. We need more mobile repair groups. And you need to quit sending people over in driblets. If you send a bomber wing over, it needs to come over with its entire maintenance team so that it can do its job. And so he defends Aker from being relieved. Again, he's found a subordinate to get the job done. He gives him the support from the flak from the highest levels, and he does an incredible job. He also helps build the infrastructure, because again, he's a construction guy, isn't he? West Point, Canal, Fort Bragg, Fort Knox, and now enough hospitals for 90,000 beds, 98 airfields. I could go on with tonnages, room for 1.5 million American soldiers, and Devers is in charge of that, and it gets done. And he's also overseeing the planning for Overlord, although he was not instrumental in the planning for Overlord, the invasion of Europe. This is a great picture. This is Jake Devers in the middle. It's Ira Aker on the right, and this man has just received the Medal of Honor because by the fall of 43, we're starting to have a chance of getting through this without getting shot down quite as badly. But it's a good deal. And because he's done a good job, and no good turn goes unpunished, when Ike returns to England and to become the commanding general of the European Theater Operations and the leader of Overlord, the first thing he does is fires Jake Devers. And the way he does it is he sends him to the Mediterranean without George Marshall knowing it's happening. It's a fait accompli. He also sends Aker, and he sends anyone close to Aker and Devers he sends to the Mediterranean. And tomorrow we'll talk about some more of why. But there's a dysfunctional relationship, leave it at that, between this great general, Eisenhower, who was a great general, and I think this other great general, who's the second ranking officer in Europe. If Ike had faltered, who would have been in charge? My bets would have been Devers and not Bradley. So now he takes over the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. He's the head of the U.S. Army forces in the Mediterranean, and he's the deputy supreme commander under the British for the entire theater of operations. He deals well with the Brits. To his right, Devers is third from left, and to his right is, oh, come on, Wheeler. I just lost it. Wilson. There we go. Jumbo Wilson, called Jumbo Wilson because of his small waist. He's called Jumbo Wilson. He's the supreme commander of the Mediterranean, and then to his right is Alexander, who's the army group commander in Italy. He's not easy to deal with, and the guy to his left is Jean, a one-armed French general who was one of the best general corps commanders of World War II. And Jake figures out how to work with these guys. It's not always easy. But the hardest thing I think he had to do in the Mediterranean is work with that horse's rear going south, who's the far right of that picture. Mark Clark. My wife said I can't swear tonight, so you're going to have to interpret the French. Mark Clark, Devers believed, wasted soldiers' lives, which is the worst thing a general can do. And he also didn't understand the personnel system. One thing Jake did is figure out how to get the personnel system unsnarled. He got permission from Marshall to have an overage of soldiers in the divisions when they went on the offense. So as the division attacked and lost a lot of men, let's say 1,000 men in the first 4 days of combat, which is not unusual in World War II, killed, wounded, missing, There's another 1,000 men already on hand, trained in the division to fill those gaps so the division doesn't lose momentum. He also told Marshall, you need to have more divisions so you can pull them out of the line and rest them. Now, Ike had never thought to do that, not because he was a bad guy, but Ike had 1 year with soldiers. He hadn't been out there at dawn feeding troops in some wet woods. He didn't know and didn't feel that part of being a general. And it's not a lick on him, but it is one of Dever's long suits, is that he understood soldiers and he didn't mind getting down amongst them. For example, here he is in March of 1944 near Cassino, watching the bombardment of Monte Cassino and visiting the American and French units there. Basically, he visited every American division in the front lines under his command at any time in World War II. Many, many times. He just went down to see how they were doing. He didn't tell the division commander what to do, because that was a corps commander and an army commander's job. He went down to see what was going on, because his job, Jake's, was to make sure the theater supported those units. So that's incredibly important. Bradley never did that routinely. If he did it at all, I would be glad to know when he did it, when he really went forward to visit divisions. I've made that challenge several places recently. So if you find out, here he is planning Anvil, the invasion of southern France. On the far left of that is General Alexander Patch, who is a very fine officer that also deserves a good book. I tell a lot about Patch in the book, so I hope you'll read it. Long story short, sitting there in West Point, I look over at my wife Jane, and we're in the archive in the Patch papers, and she's bawling. And I said, "Oh, what's wrong? What have I done now?" That's always my fallback position right away. And she was reading about the death of Patch's son in October of 1944. Incredible story, so I hope you'll read that. And one editor wanted me to take it out, and I said, "That's staying in. Heck, if the book flops." Then he asks to command 6th Army Group, because he's been planning the invasion of southern France and making sure that all the stuff was on hand for the invasion of southern France. So he asks General Marshall, "General, I know we're going to need an army group because we have a 7th U.S. Army and a 1st French Army, and we can't possibly let there be a French Army group because that would be a little hard to control. We already got a British Army group, and we're not having fun with them." And so he said, "I'd like to command 6th Army Group." Marshall writes to Ike and says, "Devers asked for it. What do you think?" And Ike writes back, "Well, I really have nothing against Jake Devers, so I guess it's okay." Boy, that's anything but high praise. But he gets command of 6th Army Group, which is an incredibly important thing, and he is the 2nd senior man in the U.S. Army in Europe because of that appointment. And he commands one of 2 U.S. Army groups in that campaign, the other one by Omar Bradley. He's a co-equal of Bradley, and we've only had those 2 Army groups and an Army group in World War I, so it's a very unique position that he filled. These are the men he commanded. Upper left, and we've talked a bit about Alexander Patch, very fine soldier. World War I, he's in the 1st Division with a guy named George Marshall. In World War II, he creates the Americal Division when the Marines bog down in Guadalcanal and get kind of encapsulated by the Japanese. And the Marine general gets a Medal of Honor when he leaves, but they still haven't won the battle, and Patch brings in the Marical Division and then commands the 14th Corps and with Tropic Lightning, the 25th Infantry, and those guys win the battle. What he gets for that campaign is not the Medal of Honor, he gets tropic dysentery, and it aggravates his World War I gas injuries. So it's a good soldier. Delattre, by the way, the other guy, is a French officer we'll talk about in a minute. This army group lands on the 15th of August, quickly captures the French, quickly capture Marseille and Toulon 3 weeks ahead of time, and they're in good enough shape that 2 weeks later, by mid-September, we have ships coming into those ports. It'll become the biggest American port in Europe, Marseille. Without it, I don't know how Ike would have gotten through the winter. And Ike appreciated that. And Ike called for that operation because he knew he needed that, and it's one of Ike's really good decisions. They go 450 miles in less than a month against the German army. They capture or kill 150,000 Germans. That's called good shooting. And they do a terrific job of fighting their way up through southern France. And eventually they end up right on the frontier. His commanders are incredible. There's Jake on the left with Patch, and on the right's Lucian Truscott, arguably one of the two best corps commanders of World War II, who also worked under Devers, and in his book did not say negative things about Devers. That to me was a positive affirmation. Another polo player, as well as Jake. Those are world-class polo players, by the way. Truscott was even better than Devers. Patton was really good. A number of these guys really loved that crazy sport. And that army will be the first army group to get to the Rhine River. On the 19th of November, the French army reaches the Rhine. 19 November 1944. For military history buffs in here, when did First Army reach the Rhine River? 9 March 1945. Quite a bit later. And on the left flank of this operation, 7th Army seizes Strasbourg and reaches the Rhine on 23 November. And tomorrow we'll talk about a missed opportunity, so I won't take the thunder from that because David Colley will be here, and he's written a really good book about it. This is a great picture because it illustrates the way Devers used people, and he knew how to identify what he needed and then to find somebody who could do it, because he knew he couldn't speak French. He spoke French almost as bad as I speak French, which is enough to scare the French. And so what he did is he had met the second from the left. His name is Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. The only senator I know who resigned his Senate seat to serve in the U.S. Army in combat. A great American who spoke fluent French, and as you know, the Cabots only spoke to the lodges, and the lodges only spoke to God. I may have that reversed, but anyway. And they all spoke French, so that does tell you what the deity might be. And this is taken at Belfort. It's called the Lion of Belfort. It's a monument at the entrance of Belfort, and the French had done an incredible breakthrough at that position. And many people my age, which is a lot of us in this room are older or younger, who have read history, get negative views of the French. And once you're done reading my book, I hope you realize that that French army that fought in 43 and 44 was as good as any American formation by far. They really do an incredible job. And they lose tons of soldiers. Their officer corps is decimated because their officers are so mad at the Germans that they're leading too far from the front, to be honest with you, for revenge. But it's a wonderful picture. To Jake's left is de Latte de Tassigny. He's a French nobleman, regular army officer, Vichy French. De Gaulle didn't like him, but he was the right guy for the job. He had a colonial army of 12 French divisions. Very hard to deal with. Jake would say when de Tassigny would come in and be mad, I'd just let him rant and rave. And once he calmed down, then I'd say, well, it'll all be okay. And he knew that de Tassigny, or de Latte, as it's really called, needed to vent. And that's a huge characteristic, to know that an officer in the military or any executive in a company needs to adjust not just to their seniors, but to their subordinates if you want to get the most out of a team. And Devers had a team with Alexander Patch, who was a strong personality, and de Latte, who was a strong personality, and he knew how to get the best out of them, and he knew when he needed a liaison officer to deal with the French, who spoke French, understood the French, and was liked by the French. Henry Cabot Lodge, the French liked this senator thing. He gave Lodge carte blanche dealing with the French. Lodge really was his liaison. He'd tell him what he wanted to get from the French. Lodge would go make it happen. So again, I think that's incredible for a guy from York who didn't speak very good French. And one of the great actions, right after the Battle of the Bulge, Patch and the 7th U.S. Army defeats the last German offensive of World War II, called Nordwind. And it was done by skillful maneuvering, and we didn't have that kind of surprise and breakthrough that we had up in the Bulge. A very fine piece of work. And so Devers had the good fortune of having two very fine Army commanders under his command, and they had the good fortune of having a boss who let them do their job. And in both cases, both said, Devers always supported me. De Latte wrote a big history, and in the case of Patch, I'm reading from his letters, because when the war ended, Patch died in October 1945. His son had been killed in 44, and his grandson dies the next year. And he prevents Ike from his biggest mistake ever. And it didn't happen because Devers finally persisted long enough that Ike didn't give up Strasbourg. And that's the great Strasbourg incident, and we talk a lot about it in the book. But it was one of those times where Devers came closest to being relieved from command, and he obeyed his orders, but he was really close to the line because Ike had insisted that he retreat from Strasbourg and surrender 600,000 Frenchmen to the Germans without a fight. And Devers did all he could, short of disobedience, from preventing that from happening. Thank God it didn't happen. Ike eventually relented, and I think Ike was just kind of fed up with a whole bunch of people at that point, to include Montgomery and de Gaulle, which is understandable, but anyway. If we had given up Strasbourg, I can't conceive of how we could have had NATO. Because NATO was shaped around the French, not the Germans. So just kind of a small thing. Huge contribution to national defense that no one will really remember unless we bring it to attention. And then he helps plan the invasion, the final invasions of Germany. His army will jump the Rhine near Mannheim and Speyer. In that region of the Rhine, the 7th U.S. Army will jump, and then the French will go across. And they will drive all the way into the heart of Germany, down into Austria, and to the Brenner Pass. They'll liberate Dachau. Some of the most powerful letters Jake wrote home to his wife, Georgie, were about what he saw, about the way the Germans had treated American prisoners of war, about the way they treated the slave labor, and about the way the death camps were. And we had a huge American atrocity committed here by 7th Army, which we talk about in there. But it's still, you could see why Americans would be a little bit mad at Germans in 1945. Ends up on the Brenner Pass. This is his personal staff. I think it says something about him. Toward the end of the book, when you read it after the war, you'll see what I mean about his warm heart. This is his personal staff. Third from left is Turnipseed, his driver throughout the war. Incredibly fine young man. After Devers retired, he and his wife adopt an African-American couple, pay for their child's medical care in 1950, give them a cottage to live in. When they move to D.C., employ them as a driver and a maid. When their kids become college age, puts their kids through college. Pretty incredible for that day and age, with no knowledge of them before then. And we're at the end of the war. He's made 4-star general. Huge debate about him becoming a 4-star general. And we won't be telling that story tomorrow, but so Marshall wrote Ike and said, who should be promoted to 4-star general? This is like January, early February 45. Ike writes back, well, of course, Toohey Spots, who is his air commander, should be, and Bradley, and Hodges, which is just to me incredible. He shouldn't have been a 3-star. And I'm sorry, that's the way that there's lots of evidence for that. And so forth. And maybe Patton later. So Marshall writes back and says, well, what about Devers? And he writes back, so, well, maybe Devers at some point, but I think these other guys should get promoted first. And Marshall writes back, then you'll have to relieve Devers, because if you promote the others to 4-star, you're basically saying you don't believe he's done a good job and you need to relieve him. That's what he says in the message. I kind of woofas and leaves it up to Marshall. When the promotions came out in March, the first one promoted, and this tells you Marshall's view, was Jacob Devers, ahead of Bradley, ahead of Hodges, ahead of Patton. Again, getting his close friend Patton to hate him even more. And then after the war, he commands Army Ground Forces. George Marshall appoints him to command Army Ground Forces before George Marshall retires in the fall of 45. Several people have seen a thing in Pogue's book called Reminiscence, where there's a negative thing said about Devers by Marshall, supposedly. If Marshall had had negative feelings about Jake, he would not have made him the commander of the biggest army organization in the United States. Leave it at that. And these are the 6 army commanders that he commands. The first one to his left is Hodges, and then Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who was a hero of Devers, class of 1904, one of these sort of teachers at West Point. I don't know the next gentleman. The next one is Bill Simpson. Simpson and Patch were never promoted to 4-star. They both totally deserved it, more than Patton, more than by far than Hodges, and never were. Patch dies without seeing it. 56, they finally promote him on the retired list. So why was he successful? I hope you get a feel for that. And if you read his OERs, you'll really get a feel for it. No question about that. They're saying about him in his 1949 OER written by Bradley that he's far fitter than most officers as junior. He's just incredible. He lives until 79, dies at age 92. Definitely, I've given you plenty of examples of that. And there was that. So I hope I've given you some ideas of why maybe you want to read the book, and also why you should be very proud of Jacob L. Devers, and he should be remembered in far more than just as Ike's forgotten general, but he should be remembered as that one of the great leaders of World War II. So I'll take questions, but thank you for your patience. I don't know how long my wife wasn't going like this yet, so I'm probably okay, but I probably went too long, and I apologize.